Hey, how you doing? Today I thought we'd meet up and grab a beer and tell some sea stories. So, the first thing I was going to talk about was the ship, of course, because that's where it all begins. Yeah. So, this particular ship was an aircraft carrier. Uh, Back in the early 80s. And that thing was technically a floating city. It had everything on board that people would need. It had doctors and dentists and some degree, a few stores, like not like a store you would see out here in the civilian world, more like a little room where you could buy like Coke and maybe some chips or something. That's about it. They sold cigarettes and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, once we were out into the water a certain few miles, then there was no tax on stuff either. So I remember paying 35 cents a pack for cigarettes. They've gone up drastically. Like now they're $8 or $9 a pack. Crazy. But yeah, it had that was the size of the store. It wasn't anything special, but nonetheless, just a small store where you could buy some stuff. Not like a grocery store. You didn't really cook meals or anything on the ship. There was two galleys. There was a fore and aft galley. So at meal times they would usually serve different things. Like the one might have a regular meal, which was always sketchy because at sea, you were disconnected from food also. It's not like a restaurant or something where they can just get trucks to deliver steaks and potatoes and stuff like that. The food had to be carried to the ship. And as you could guess, there's limited space to store food because most of the ship is designed for work and stuff like that, not catering large meals or anything. But that was the choice at the one galley, and say it would be like you know ham and potatoes and some vegetable. Now the other part of it is a lot of the stuff was powdered also because it was easier to store and took less space when you're carrying it on the ship. So then let's say the other galley always would just serve like sliders, so hamburgers that were a little sketchy, but you could eat them. They were there. And it was always quicker too than the one mess all up front. But like I said, the ship had everything, including the galleys and stuff. It had lawyers and jails. It actually had courtrooms and stuff on the ship. They had a gym, which it wasn't like a gym today, but it was a room where had some weights and stuff, like free weights, that you could go there and lift weights in your off time. And they had the doctors and dentists and stuff. So if somebody got sick, they would go down to sick bay. As a matter of fact, during one cruise, I had my 4 wisdom teeth cut out by the Navy surgeons that were there. Of course, the hangar bay, that was the primary reason for the ship, was carry a lot of planes. So there was the hangar bay where they generally stored the planes. They would park all the planes down there in the hangar, and then once they had them parked in the hangar, then they could move them with like little tow truck things, put them onto the elevator, lift them up to the flight deck, and then from there they could get them launched and recovered and stuff like that. One thing about this ship that was the noise, because they would launch night or day, whenever, it didn't matter. So we would work 12-hour shifts. There was always the day shift and then the night shift. So they could carry on the flight ops and stuff during the day and then turn around and do them the same night or the next night. It didn't matter if it was night or day. As a matter of fact, there was no such thing really as even a day of the week. It wasn't like, oh, you'd be on the ship and you'd work Monday through Friday and then have off on a weekend. There was no such thing as a weekend, because when you were out at sea, it didn't matter what day of the week it was. You're doing the same thing every day. So we worked 12-hour shifts. So it was 12 on, 12 off, 12 on, 12 off, no matter what day it was. And I'm sure everybody's seen movies like Top Gun and stuff like that. It was a little bit different when you're actually living on there, simply because of the noise even. The planes were loud, of course, and they had like 8-foot or more flame coming out the exhaust of the jet engine. It was interesting to see. I worked on the radar systems on the ship, so the tower part of the ship is the piece that sticks up above the flight deck, and then the radar systems were above the island. But in the island where the tower was, would be the captain and the air boss and stuff like that. They had these big glass windows that they could see down onto the flight deck, so they could watch what was going on, time everything. So in general, what we did, let's just say for a 1-year schedule, we would go out to sea for 1 month. We would come back for a couple of weeks. Then we would go out to sea for 3 months, and then we would come back for a couple of weeks. And then we would go out for a 6-month cruise. 6-month cruise, a lot of times it turned into 7 months or more, because it all depended on what was going on in the world and where we needed to be. It wasn't like they said, oh, we're going to leave on this exact day and then we'll be back exactly 6 months later. That might have been the rough idea, but as soon as something happened, we would end up getting delayed on coming back. So, back to the floating city. The bunks and stuff were a whole nother story. Like the sleeping quarters, there was a stack of 3 bunks. So say from the floor to the ceiling, let's say it was like 10 feet or whatever, there would be a bunk on the floor. Like, the bunks had a bit of a drawer underneath them that you could store uniforms and stuff in. And then the bunk itself was just wide enough, for like the average size human, and just long enough for the average size human. I know a lot of the guys who were quite a bit taller than me were always complaining because they couldn't fit lengthwise in the bunks. So they had to sleep like with their knees folded up and stuff, to try to get their feet onto the bunk. It wasn't built for somebody who was, 6 foot and over. It was like, if you're like 6'4" or something, your feet are going to stick out over the edge of the bunk. And like I say, they were just wide enough, for a human, like normal size, like this. They weren't any size that you would see in the civilian world. They were small. And then, so the one bunk was on the floor like this. Then it was like maybe 2 foot. And then the next bunk was up here. And then it would be another 2 foot. And then the top bunk was up here. And then there was maybe 2 foot on top of that bunk. So there was a set of 3 of these, say here, for example, against this wall. And then there was a set of lockers. These lockers were like maybe 2 foot in width. And then is the next set of 3 bunks. So there's 6 guys with a set of lockers in between. So it was a good thing that some of the people worked the opposite 12-hour shift, because otherwise all 6 of these guys are trying to get ready for work at the same time, and there's only a 2 foot space. So you couldn't roll out of your bunk when someone else was in the 2 foot space. You just had to wait and let them get out of the way, and then you could roll out of your bunk. So that was the setup. And then on this set of 3 bunks, there were 3 more on the opposite side, another set of these lockers, and then 3 more bunks on that side. And it went that way, for as many feet long as your particular quarters were where you were sleeping. I think in the division where I was at in electronics, because I was an electronics technician, in that bunking quarters we had roughly 80 guys, like I said, lined up with the bunks. 6 people here, 6 people here, 6 people here, 6 people here. And then there was about 2 foot in between that you could walk down long, and then it was the same setup on the opposite side of the room where the quarters were. Be another row, the same identical pattern with 6 people, 6 people, 6 people. And in total, there was like 80 guys in my division. So, needless to say, it was crammed quarters. There was not much room because every piece of the ship is taken up to do the functions of the ship. It didn't matter that the guys didn't have much room for sleeping. That was not the concern of the Navy. Yeah, so that was the size of the sleeping quarters. But there was another whole fiasco with the getting showers and getting teeth brushed and all that stuff in the morning. Right down the passageway from there was where the heads were at, the restrooms and stuff, and that's there was be like a row of sinks, row of toilets, and showers and stuff. But it was nothing to brag about, and there usually wasn't any hot water. It was a rare thing to find hot water on the ship. But the people were definitely crowded. You know, you're talking about a floating city where when we were at sea, we held about 5,000 guys. So there was a mix of those because we had the air wings on board when we were at sea. So the planes all get maintained and managed by the air wing people. They weren't part of ship's company. Ship's company was the people who lived on the ship indefinitely. I mean, even if we were in port, the air wings would fly back to their air base. The ship's company would stay, of course, with the ship. So, and of course, when you're in port, a place like Norfolk is deep enough that the carrier can pull into a pier. Now, that's not the case, you know, when you're out at sea. Some of the places we would visit, they don't have deep enough ports for an aircraft carrier. So what we would do is the aircraft carrier would anchor out a certain distance where it was plenty deep. And then we would take John boats in to Fleet Landing to where we could pull right against a pier, and then the people could get off the John boat. Now, this John boat probably carried 40 or 50 guys at a time. So you can imagine when you pulled into port with 5,000 guys on a carrier, trying to take these smaller John boats in to a pier so that we could go into a city. So sometimes the ports were far and few between. As a matter of fact, I remember once on a 7-month cruise, I had my feet on land 9 days out of 7 months. That's a little crazy, but that's the way it was. And it's a weird feeling being at sea for that long, because you actually get to the point where you're like, you know, I kind of miss seeing trees, you know, because all you see is water. When you're out, your line of sight is like, I don't know, maybe 17 miles to the horizon, when you're at sea. So most of the time, if you look anywhere around the ship, there's nothing but water. You don't see trees and stuff like that. So that's why I say sometimes you'd be like, huh, kind of miss trees and grass and stuff. But at least there was 45 days. If we were at sea for 45 days straight, we would have a beer day. Yeah. 45 days at sea. And of course, the U.S., there's no drinking on the carrier. When I say it's a floating city, it's a floating city minus any bars or restaurants, because the U.S. government doesn't have alcohol on their ships. So once we were out at sea for 45 days, it would be a big event, because now there's a beer day where we would have beer flown onto the carrier. And we called it Steel Beach Day, because everything, of course, is steel. There's nothing. It's not like these ships are wood and carpet and stuff like that. Everything is steel, including the floors. The floors are steel, but then we put tile over top of the floors. Nonetheless, it was called a Steel Beach Day. And all the guys on the ship were issued two cans of beer. Yeah. Each guy, 2 cans of beer. Now you can imagine, for guys who didn't drink, what they did was sold their 2 cans of beer. And I know one of your next questions is going to be, evidently, you drink beer, right? And if you knew somebody who didn't drink, you must have bought their cans of beer. Correct. 1 can of beer, this size, the going rate was $80 for a can. So me and other people who I knew, it was the most expensive beer that you ever bought. But I remember paying $80 back then for a can of beer. That's steep. But of course, you can imagine there weren't many people who didn't drink. So it was a matter of supply and demand at that point. And at 45 days at sea, who cares if it's $80 for a can of beer? The fact is, it's there. And that's the only way to get it. You can't, there's no other way to get beer. It's not like every day the ship would pull into a port somewhere and you could just buy beer. No, that's what I was telling you. 9 days out of 7 months, my feet were on land. That's not very many days. And the other thing was, too, you know, yes, it's a floating city, but there's also no radio or TV. You know, you're too far out to sea to get radio reception or TV reception or anything like that. So for music, we made sure we carried our cassette tapes on board before we left. That way you have music you can listen to. But until they came out with VCRs, there was no TV or anything. You know, it's too isolated for TV. Now, at the end, I think at the last cruise that I made, by that point they had come out with VCRs. So in my group of radar that I worked in, there might have been 15 guys. And so the one guy bought a VCR, and I think at the time he paid like $800 for the VCR. They were salty when they first came out. But then all of us other guys would get tapes. So we would get different videotapes that we could play in the VCR. But it's still a limited number. So between us, we might have had 10 or 20 tapes. And when you think about a 7-month cruise, you're watching the same 10 or 20 VCR movies for 7 months. But hey, at least we could watch them. It wasn't like we had no TV. We had those 10 or 20 tapes. Well, this beer is shot. Time for another one. But I'll catch you next time. Take it easy. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you later.